Hello and welcome to my thoughts on the danger of a single story for the IGCSE English Language examination. This anthology text is from the 2009 TED Talk, and therefore it has an audience rather than a reader. It uses language devices specific to a speech, such as spoken features like so and but to start sentences. It is really helpful to watch Adichie's delivery, as she is a very powerful speaker, and it's perhaps more apparent where the humorous parts are due to her audience's reactions and the pauses she takes to allow for laughter. The single story is an extended metaphor for prejudice and the ignorance that leads to making your mind up without really knowing someone's context. It is therefore important to discuss the title, as stories are the central metaphor of the speech, and she returns to this frequently throughout the text. The danger of a single story aims to persuade its reader of the dangers of ignorance and the beauty of understanding that there is no such thing as a single story when you actually think and find out. It is also a cautionary tale as signalled by the noun danger in the title. The first thing that Chimamanda Adichie tells the audience is that she is a storyteller. The personal pronoun engages the listener from the outset and serves as an effective hook as she then moves into a series of personal anecdotes. From the opening, Adichie begins to establish credibility with her listener, making her more likeable. When she tells the reader that her mother says she started reading at the age of 2, yet in Adichie's modest view, it was more like 4, the gentle and self-deprecating humour endears her to the listener. The informal so to open the sentence, "so I was an early reader," creates a conversational tone and conforms to the spoken language convention, marking this out as a spoken text rather than written, but additionally serves to make Adichie likeable to her audience. The humour continues as Adichie mentions her poor mother, who was obligated to read Adichie's childhood stories with the verb choice obligated and the adjective poor, possibly evoking similar memories in parents in the audience, or in adults who themselves may have been keen writers. The listing which follows the colon and begins "all my characters" is perhaps reflective of the monotony of Adichie's own early stories. The clichés she lists of white, blue-eyed characters who played in the snow, ate apples and talked about the weather alienate Adichie, and this is underscored through the pronoun they, which serves to exclude Adichie from this experience. These clichés are skillfully juxtaposed in the paragraph which follows when Adichie relates her early readings to her own experiences in Nigeria. Adichie parallels the snow with the lack of snow in Nigeria, for instance, while contrasting the apples with the mangoes and the interest in the weather being decidedly less in Nigeria, where there is not as much discussion of the weather than in other cultures and countries, such as the UK. Her use of the inclusive pronouns we juxtaposes with the earlier they of the previous paragraph, showing the books she has read as the antithesis of her own experiences. Adichie begins to see the power of representation in children's literature, a point which is developed further in the paragraphs which follow. As I mentioned earlier, a skillful use of Aristotle's rhetorical triangle composed of pathos, ethos, and logos helps Adichie to build a persuasive argument. At this point in the speech, she has effectively created ethos and established credibility, trust, and likability in her audience. Adichie builds this unity with the audience as she opens this paragraph with the inclusive we pronoun. Emotive adjectives vulnerable and impressionable create pathos in the reader, and this is yet more effective when Adichie notes this, particularly in children. Adichie makes a link between reading and writing at this point, and as a child was convinced the texts she produced had to have the same qualities within them. The lack of representation in the literature she experiences as a child therefore impacts her early writing until she discovered African writers. The scarcity of African books begins to illustrate the all-pervasive nature and powerful influence of Western literature. Citing the examples of two African writers gives Adichie credibility, as it further shows her to credible and well-read. That people like the narrator could also exist, particularly with the adverb also, is a moving line which underscores the power of and indeed importance of representation in literature. The writer continues to build her rapport with the audience as the text continues by not alienating her audience by speaking negatively about the American and British books she read as a child, but rather showing how the African texts allowed her to feel seen, to exist, as she states. The line, "So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this," has a colon separating it from the rest of the line. This colon draws importance to the statement which follows, and shows that, in contrast to the danger in the title, stories also have the power to save and are not always dangerous. This more balanced argument is convincing to the listener. Adichie then moves on to her background, and the listener understands that she has had a relatively privileged upbringing. She recounts how the "got a houseboy" and the verb "got" perhaps foreshadows the young Adichie's attitude to those she considered less fortunate than herself. "Got" suggests possession and the reductive and ignorant portrayal of others before Adichie herself gained a better understanding of what she calls the danger of a single story. It also endears her to the audience who see that anyone can fall victim to this single story, even the writer. This means that the audience feels less judged by the speaker and is more likely to agree with her message. When Adichie's mother tells her to finish your food and that Fidi's family have nothing, this is perhaps relatable to the listener whose own parents may have made similar comparisons at the dinner table growing up. Adichie continues the anecdote about Fidi and his family, and the short declarative sentence, "I was startled," shows the moment at which the narrator learned the error in her thinking. She is startled, and this suggests a physical reaction or movement, suggesting the strength of this realization. She states that it had not occurred to her that anyone could actually make something. Within this sentence, the fact that it had not occurred to her shows her ignorance towards stereotypes and the secret power these have over us. She didn't even realize that she had this preconceived idea of Fidi. Then the "actually" in "anyone could actually make something" reinforces just how mistaken her initial thoughts about Fidi's family have been. Their poverty is juxtaposed with "my single story," which allows the listener to see that the narrator is critiquing herself and certainly doesn't consider herself innocent or immune to falling victim to the single stories of others. When Adichie moves to the United States to study, she finds herself the victim of a single story. But just as Adichie doesn't react with bitterness to the lack of representation in her childhood books, she reacts with humor and understanding in this instance too. The roommate applies stereotypes to the music she thinks Adichie listens to, calling it tribal music, which of course has connotations of savages and a lack of civilization, in direct contrast to the life we know structurally from the previous paragraph. Adichie has in Nigeria. There is gentle humour at the Mariah Carey tape, but the next paragraph, "She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove," is structurally presented in a single-line paragraph to show how shocking this misunderstanding is. Nonetheless, the line is also wryly amusing at the expense of the ignorant roommate. Adichie uses the colon again in the following paragraph in the same way as she did earlier, and again this draws attention to the sentence which follows, as it creates a pause and therefore a dramatic effect. Again, though, Adichie is careful not to offend or alienate her audience and terms her roommate's view of her as well-meaning pity, rather than prejudice, which has limited her friend's ability to see beyond the stereotype. The single story of Africa is, in itself, mocking, as Africa is a vast continent composed of many countries. In the passage, she refers to herself as an African, more frequently than she refers to herself as Nigerian, perhaps to reflect others' impressions of her, and to gently mock this deep-seated ignorance. Once more, Adichie uses the colon in this paragraph, but in this case to introduce a skillful parallel structure. A single story of Africa. A single story of catastrophe. Africa is replaced by catastrophe to show the far-reaching negative impressions others may have of this continent. Adichie then moves to use repetition within a lengthy list, with the refrain "no possibility of" to underscore just how negative others' perceptions of African can be. As this text moves on, Adichie shares some of her wider experiences of narrow-mindedness by listing the stereotypes that she is exposed to in the United States, which have helped her understand how these impressions are formed. These clichés are likely to resonate with the audience. For example, the kind white stranger often seen on social media nowadays, or perhaps for the older listener, on TV campaigns such as Live Aid in the 1980s. As mentioned earlier, she opens this paragraph, and indeed the next, with "so and this informal usage is typical of a speech, and also this means that, although her speech serves as a cautionary tale, the audience never feels lectured, but instead forms a warm relationship with the speaker." This is enhanced by the anecdotes throughout, of course, which show that it's easy for anyone to make this mistake, but also that it's important to correct it. Adichie moves to another anecdote about her time in Mexico after a period of time spent in the United States. We are encouraged to see that due to Adichie's own reactions to the Mexicans, she doesn't resent her roommate's small-mindedness, as she has been both exposed to these views and is later guilty of them herself. The power of the American media has reinforced the single story of Mexicans, and the negative continuous verbs like fleecing and sneaking and being arrested, all drawn from the semantic field of crime, are listed before the anticlimactic ending, "that sort of thing," which implies through Adichie's dismissive tone that she doesn't really believe it. Adichie's use of asyndetic listing in going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing, suggests an endlessness to the activities, and as all these activities are seen as positive, present a juxtaposition to the earlier negative listing of the paragraph before. The listener understands Adichie's own move towards understanding through these close observations of the people she had inadvertently judged. She explains through the verb phrase "I had bought into" that she had made this choice, and she will take responsibility for this through the shame she feels as a result. At this point, Adichie moves to her conclusion. She opens with her conjunction "so," as she has done so many times previously in this speech, and sums up how to create this metaphorical single story. Adichie uses short declaratives to assert her point that stories matter. The anaphora in the openings of these sentences and the repetition of the noun stories reminds the listener of the title and the importance of stories. The parallel between stories can break and stories can also repair in this section gives the listener hope. This antithesis is signalled by the conjunction "but." The tone in this paragraph in particular is markedly different from the earlier material. There is determination in this as she reinforces her main point on the importance of stories to empower and humanize, but also, more concerningly, to dispossess and malign. The reference to Pulitzer Prize winner Alice Walker, an African-American writer who bravely tells a different story, shows that when communities have greater access to historical resources and more diverse stories are being brought into our collective history, we are rejecting the danger of a single story. The metaphorical "a kind of paradise was regained" shows the beauty in gaining this different understanding. The final line also employs anaphora in "when we" and repeats Adichie's earlier technique of the colon to draw attention to the importance of the final sentence, which through that anaphora is climactic. The use of the inclusive pronoun "we" emphasizes to the audience the collective responsibility, which we all have to reject the single story, and invites the audience to reflect on where our own ideas come through. Thank you for listening. Good luck with your exam.